And so we were all working on open source stuff, and there was no really good place to share it. Most people would kind of host their own servers or put it on something like SourceForge. And so when they were talking about, having a really nice place to put Git code, that was really, I think, what the original vision was a place for side projects, a place for open source, a depot that you could put open source code. In the beginning, it was really just code hosting that didn't suck, right? And I don't even think that they had an idea to monetize it at first. I think that actually came because one of our friends, Jeffrey Grosenbach, he wanted to use it for private stuff, right? He was like, I love this, I want to use Git, but I don't want to, have this for my public stuff and then have to run my own Git server as well. But it's for private code, right? So can I pay you to make that private?
It's DeAndre here, and this is the Pioneers Show, the show where we talk with innovators, makers, entrepreneurs, basically people who are trailing their own trails and creating their own lives, so that we all can learn how to work on our own lives. This is episode 17, and I'm your host, Andre de Albuquerque. You can find me at It's DeAndre on Twitter and on Instagram, as well as the show at Pioneers Show on Instagram as well. Truth be told, this is going to be part of a two-part episode. The conversation I had with this episode's guest was so enticing that when we stopped talking and looked at the clock, almost 2 hours went by. So, in order to be easier to consume the conversation, I decided to cut it into two different episodes. Funny thing, it's almost as though it was meant to be. It's clearly divided in half by the two different main themes. However, as you can imagine, we talk about 100 different things. But enough explaining the structure, so let me introduce the guest. This week's guest is Scott Chacon. Scott is one of the co-founders of GitHub, one company that, if you've never heard of it, most clearly you're not a developer. GitHub is one of the main spots for teams to work on code together, and Scott is one of its co-founders. On top of it, he's the author of ProGit, a book about the underlying technology and techniques that GitHub is based on. Besides that, he's also the founder and CEO of Cherubug, a new language learning startup that is trying to revolutionize today's somewhat saturated market. With companies of the like of Duolingo and Babbel, Scott figured he found a different solution to work on the language learning problem. In this episode, we clearly focus on his experience of GitHub, what it is, what it does, and briefly mention his acquisition by Microsoft. Yeah, basically they were just reportedly acquired by around $7.5 billion. I can't stress enough how much this interview meant for me and how awesome and genuine a person Scott seems to be. Without talking anymore, I hope you enjoy the first part of my conversation with Scott Chacon. And here with us, we have Scott. Hello, Scott. Welcome to the Pioneers Show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I've been looking for someone who's much more on the technical side, but also on the business side, which is kind of hard to find, even though some of the previous guests have been. So, for people who don't know who you are, care to give us like a pitch about Scott?
Sure. So my name is Scott Chacon. I'm American. I grew up in California and I worked in tech for a while, being a software developer. I was one of the co-founders of GitHub. If you don't know what GitHub is, it's a sort of large Facebook for programmers, a place to share code, right? And if you are in tech, you probably know what GitHub is. But so yeah, I was there in the Bay Area for about 8 years at GitHub, and then I've recently left GitHub and started a new company called Chatterbug. That's a language learning company that's mostly based in Berlin.
Great. Okay, so then before we go on to GitHub specifically, so you were at software development. Was it always there? How were you like as a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I got interested in computers probably pretty early. I didn't really program or do any of that until later, but my grandfather was really into computers and had one of those sort of computers with the big 8-inch floppy drives that you'd stick stuff in, or like the tape, the actual like cassette tape storage systems. And so I was around computers a little bit and kind of shared that interest in them. But I didn't actually get into programming until I graduated from high school. So it wasn't like I was, in the basement as a high schooler, working on Unix or something. But it just became fun, like a hobby, really. Like I worked on it professionally. I, compiled my own Linux kernels and stuff in college. Like that was sort of the thing that I was into. I was like the one guy using Linux for all of my college stuff, from all of my friends and everything, even including people that were in CS in San Diego. I went to UC San Diego. And it just became something that was really interesting. When I graduated, I actually graduated with an art degree, and it was just seemed more fun to do the computer stuff. So I ended up getting a job in it, and it was always kind of easy for me. It was always very interesting for me. It was always something I liked doing in my spare time as well. And so I've been kind of really lucky that I get to do something that pays very well, that has, been great for me, but also, I would just do on the weekends anyways, right? Like it's something that is just very interesting to me to make computers do things. I enjoy the logic and I think it's fun. So yeah, I mean, I guess, the sort of privilege of my upbringing, that my grandpa had a computer in the house in a time when almost nobody did, allowed me to get into it, but I wasn't like hacking on stuff until I was older.
Interesting. Okay. So, and touching on that, so you learned how to program after high school and college.
Yeah, I took computer science classes in high school, but I wasn't really interested in it. I wasn't doing it in my spare time or anything until I got a job doing it. And it started interestingly, it started as data entry. So like I got a temp job through like a youth employment thing in my hometown, in between high school and going off to college. And it was essentially just like, here's, Fox Pro database or whatever, go through them and go through like this list of instructions and try to filter them on these things, and then print out lists, and we'll mail it out it was for a trade show company. And why I really got into computer programming is because I realized that Fox Pro actually had a scripting language behind it. And so not just that you could write programs to go and do some of these things and automate them, but you could also run SQL. So there was actually a SQL engine in it, and nobody that I was working with even knew this. And so I like pulled a book off the shelf to try to make my repetitive job a little bit easier. And ended up writing these scripts. And after a while, the guy in the data, processing, the temp kid in the data processing thing, was writing scripts that were replacing people's jobs in the company because they didn't know how to make the software more efficient. And so I kind of software programmed my way out of a job there, and they just because we could process things so much faster with the software that I wrote, and so they transferred me to the programming portion of the company, and I ended up working remotely for that company the whole way through college. So, but that's how I got into it. Right, is like I was given a boring job and then realized that the tool was scriptable, and then tried to make my own job easier. And got into it that way. And I feel like I'm still kind of doing that, right? Like you see a problem, it's really repetitive, it's not very efficient, and computer programming can help make that more efficient. And just that love of that interest in fixing a problem like that, I think is what's kind of driven me through my whole career.
I think that's really curious because you're literally not the first person to tell me this. And actually on the podcast, the 10th episode with Jack Sink, he's a former investor, used to be on the Democratic Congress, not Congress. He was part of the Hillary Clinton social media digital communication strategy. And he literally said that he learned how to program because he found a job that was boring and found a way to automate it.
Yeah.
And have you ever read the book Deep Work?
No.
The first example that the Cal Newport, I think that's what he says, is that a guy that used to do data entries on Excel figured out how to work on macros. Yeah. So for 7 or 8 months, I think I might be not entirely, but he was learning how to program on the side while doing macros and doing things much faster than senior analysts in that company. And then he quit the job and went into computer science, and now he's a programmer somewhere. But yeah. I like that idea. And one of the things that I kind of see in the developer area is that I'm not entirely sure. I'm seeing this from someone from the side. I'm not a technical person just yet, but I seem to think that almost all developers are self-taught.
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously go through school and do it and get a job and have a good career. I think if you learn it in college or whatever. I mean, I learned when I was in college, but I did teach myself a lot because of the problem sets that I was looking at. But I was also there were people in the computer science department at UCSD, which is a really good computer science department, that are in that field because their parents wanted them to go into computer science, and thought that it was a good career for them, and kind of, forced them down that path. And you could tell that they didn't like it. Like they didn't really love computers. Like they programmed on it for school projects, and they would get through and they get a degree and a career, and they go on, but they weren't playing with stuff, in their spare time. And I found it through trying to automate a thing, but then I kind of fell in love with it because it's just you can create anything, right? And it's like, I don't know, getting interested in cameras or something, right? Where you start it for having a particular reason, and then you become like a nerd in it, because the deeper you go, the more interesting it gets, right? And you're building your own cameras, or you're getting into the game, and you would, even if you don't need it professionally, right? And it just so happens with computers, it's really useful professionally to have this type of interest as well. But I mean, there are definitely lots of people that I think have gotten really, really success, gone on and had good careers and been successful that weren't really self-taught, but they also don't have a love for it, right? And so, well, I think that's possible. I don't know why it would be worth it. Like I think if you're not doing what you love every day,
why do it?
Yeah, why do it? Yeah.
And once again, touching on something you just said, as that I can share with you the example of this podcast specifically. I was never an audio person. I listened to music, but I didn't care anything about that. And I remember back in Portugal, I wanted to know entrepreneurs in Portugal, so I decided I wanted to get on the same table as some people in the Portuguese ecosystem. But since they were too big or high level for me, I didn't know how to get them. So basically my idea was I will record them and say it's a media thing and they will love it. But I didn't know anything about podcasting, didn't know about anything about microphones, headphones. And right now, even though I might not have the best gear, I can tell you the best gear for any situation. So it's something that I've been toying on my spare time, trying to learn more about frequencies and which kind of materials it's about. So it's fun that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, whatever you're doing, you should love it because you're doing it every day. And it's interesting for me as well. We'll probably get into the GitHub thing in a bit, but it was acquired by Microsoft, and I have a fair amount of I had a fair amount of percentage stock in that as well, and so I don't really technically need to work, right? It's not. I could just do nothing for the rest of my life, but it's really boring. And what's interesting is that on hearing news of that. Because I have this other startup that I'm running, and it can be stressful, and I am still programming. It's small enough that I'm still doing a lot of actual software development. But it was a very easy decision to keep doing this, right? And actually to take what I've gotten from the GitHub thing and reinvest it into this, because even though I don't need to work, this is what I love doing. And when I was doing it at GitHub, I didn't start at GitHub because I thought it was going to be a big thing that was going to sell to Microsoft for all of this money and stuff. I did it because it was just a really in fact, it was very difficult for me financially to go and do GitHub because I was at a better paying job before that. It's not, at the beginning, startups don't pay very well, right?
Or at all.
Yeah. And so, but it was just fun. Like, it was an interesting thing that I wanted to see in the world. And so I appreciate it when people are doing passion projects like this, things that they really love to do, right?
And since we already touched on GitHub, we can segue into that. So first of all, just to get an idea from things that I've read and might be scattered around the internet, you're one of the co-founders of GitHub, but you weren't, from what I've read, there are 3 members and then you kind of...
Yeah. So it's sort of a fine line between first employee and co-founder. There was Chris and Tom were the first 2 people that had sort of started working on the project together, and then brought on PJ a few months later, and then hired me actually as a consultant a few months after that. And then I came on full time, but we didn't hire any other software developers for probably a year after that, as we tried to get the business to the point that we could pay salaries. And so very technically, I'm a co-founder of the GitHub C Corporation, because we were an LLC before that, and which I was not a co-founder of, so from the very beginning. But then we reincorporated, and my name is in the founding document. So you could argue it either way. It's not really important to me. The reason why I talk about that is because internally in the company we would refer to me as a co-founder. Like all of the employees knew me as a co-founder because it was useful for communication purposes.
Of course,
right?
I just wanted to figure out.
Yeah. But yeah.
So you mentioned, two friends, then another one joined in. You were in as consultant, and a few months later you were hired full-time. So let's start from the moment you were already working with them, and specifically. So let's take even a step back. Yep. You already mentioned what GitHub is, the Facebook for developers. Was that always the idea? Was that always the side project? Was that always the vision?
That's hard to say. I'm trying to think back to sort of the original vision. Because the original vision was really more Tom and Chris's. What I came on for was because I was in love with Git at the time. And so I was using it a whole lot at the job that I was at. There weren't that many people really using it professionally at that time. And I was going to these Ruby meetups and talking about Git and showing people Git and writing, Ruby implementations of Git and kind of trying to teach people what it was and how to use it and why it was cool. And that's how I actually met all three of them, is we all met at these Ruby meetups. And so when they were talking about GitHub, right, they wanted a nice hosting solution that was kind of like SourceForge, but better, right? Just thinking of everything they hated about SourceForge.
SourceForge being the GitHub before the platform by then.
Being a place to upload source code before that, open source stuff. And so we were all working on open source stuff, and there was no really good place to share it. Most people would kind of host their own servers or put it on something like SourceForge. And so when they were talking about, having a really nice place to put Git code, that was really, I think, what the original vision was a place for side projects, a place for open source, a depot that you could put open source code. And a lot of the collaboration features that came later actually really weren't there in the beginning. It was really just code hosting that didn't suck, right? And I don't even think that they had an idea to monetize it at first. I think that actually came because one of our friends, Jeffrey Grosenbach, who does a podcast and has a publishing company, he wanted to use it for private stuff, right? He was like, I love this, I want to use Git, but I don't want to, have this for my public stuff and then have to run my own Git server as well. But it's for private code, right? So can I pay you to make that private? And so we were like, I guess so. And I think PJ went and implemented the billing system that weekend so that somebody who asked to pay us for it could pay us for it, right? Which I think is a really great place to be, right? Is having customers say,
I could pay for this.
Yeah, I would really like to pay you for this thing. And in the early days, actually, we had a lot of people paying for private repositories that weren't using them just because they wanted a way to pay us. Like they liked the open source stuff so much. They would sign up for a private account and not put anything in it and just say I want to help out with this project and make sure you guys don't go away. And so it really grew organically, right? That wasn't really the idea, was to be this massive place that had all of the source code in the world. It was really just a good tool focused on an individual developer. Mm-hmm. What does that experience look like for an individual developer? And I think that's a good way to approach things, right? Is not necessarily from what the grand vision of the thing is, but from the individual user, and say, is this a great, if you're doing product like this, is this a great experience for this person? And does this really help this person's life?
I think that's probably, I've never experienced that myself, but I think that should be one of the best sensations as a founder, as a creator of a product, is first of all, to have people to pay for something just for the sake of paying it and enjoying and showing consideration for the creator's work. But at the same time, just when you probably have no idea of monetization, you have someone who kind of gives you the idea, and it's a perfect fit for expectations and need. So I think you guys clearly found somewhere something there that happened to be a good fit in the market and with your clients' needs. And I think that should be a great sensation when you get someone to say, hey, I would pay you for this. You probably might think, well, okay, and let's see how it goes from there, I assume.
Yeah, I think we reacted to the community's needs a lot in the early days, and trying to build something that was really useful for people, and responding to their needs. And I think that focusing on that really helped the business, as opposed to focusing on how to make more money, right?
If first of all, and before we go on and talking a little bit more GitHub, you mentioned several times Git. For more technical people, sure. For less technical people rather, what's Git?
Right. So Git is a version control system that is sort of the heart of GitHub. And so essentially, if you're let's say writing a book, right, you'd maybe write the first chapter in a file or something, and then this version control system allows you to tell the system to take a snapshot of what that chapter looks like, and then you could go in and edit it and rearrange it and take another snapshot and edit it and rearrange it and take another snapshot.
Second version, third version.
Somebody else could take it, like a co-author could take it and rewrite one of the paragraphs while you're adding more to the end, and then you could take a look at that and merge it together really easily instead of going through and doing it by hand. And so it's just a really nice way of tracking work, right, over sort of the history of work and collaborating with other people on version documents. And so source code has been under version control systems. There's been a whole bunch of them over the last 20, 30 years. And Git is one of the newer incarnations of it. But I've been using version control systems since a whole bunch of them for 20 years probably.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, as a non-technical person myself, I've heard about GitHub millions of times, but I've never been a user per se. I think I've downloaded one application there once because it's possible apparently. Yeah. Okay, so going back to GitHub, so you join as a co-founder, and you don't hire a developer or an engineer for a full year. Yeah. When you left the company, how many people were there? When
I left the company, there were, I think, 450 employees. Yeah, so we grew it organically. Actually, we didn't take any VC, any fundraising. We didn't do any fundraising
at all.
Yeah, we bootstrapped the company. I think Chris put like $10,000 into it or something from a savings account that he had, and then we all worked for very low salaries at first, especially for the Bay Area. And then as we were making money, as the site was making more and more money, we would just up our salaries every month until it got more into a livable range. I think we all ate into our savings for a while there at the beginning. But yeah, so our costs weren't particularly high. We had friends at hosting companies and stuff that cut us deals on having the site be live for sort of putting their logo at the bottom and things like that. So we kept costs really low for a while. And so as our user base grew and we made more money, we got our salaries up to where they kind of was more normal for the area over the course of 6 months or so after I had started. And then another 6 months of sort of growth until we could really hire another person. And we hired 2 people, I think, the next November or something, 2009 probably this was. And we grew that way for about 100 employees, right? So every time that every couple months and then every month, we would kind of see what our recurring revenue was and say, okay, we have enough money to hire another person now, and we hire another person. And then that window got shorter and shorter as we were growing faster. And so then we were hiring a whole bunch of people, like a couple a month or a couple a week. And then we got up to about 100 employees and decided to raise a round of funding because we were in a really good position to do so, right? We were completely profitable. And a lot of the VCs knew who we were. All of their portfolio companies used us, right? So they all wanted to be invested in us. And so we were in a really good bargaining position at the time. And so we raised our first round. We raised $100 million as our very first round of financing when we had 100 employees. And then I was there for another 5 years probably. And we ended up raising a second round. And those were the only 2 rounds that we raised before the Microsoft sale, which happened a few months ago.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, so from my understanding, you basically hired engineers as the financial capability of the company went up.
Right. Mostly engineers, yeah. Yeah, we hired some other people as well, but we never really got into marketing very heavily. I think we hired one person after we closed the first round. So we didn't have a marketing person until we were over 100 employees.
Because the word of mouth was...
Yeah, it was all word of mouth, yeah. We didn't have... or some other PR. We didn't have, there were a whole bunch of... We didn't have a CFO. We didn't really have a finance team until we were making millions of dollars a month probably at that point, and we didn't have a CFO. So we were really focused on engineering, and I think today, looking back at it, that was probably a mistake. I think we should have been a little bit broader and thought through the business a little bit more. But we were open source developers and younger at the time, obviously, and looking at the problem that we had, which was trying to build this thing for engineers, and so we were hiring engineers to solve that problem, right? And there was they were also product, right? All of our engineers, we were building things that we were using for ourselves. And so, we didn't have like a product team or anything. It was really just engineering was like the bulk of the company.
If I may ask, why, looking back now, why do you think you should have targeted more and got more finance people, product people? Is there any reason why, from your experience, of course, but what makes you think that just going engineer route was probably not I won't say best decision, but...
I mean, we didn't, there were other decisions we made that were good. I should say a good amount of the company was customer service as well. And so it was probably, 60-40 or 70-30 engineering and customer service. So we did have a lot of customer service people, but, which is incredibly important, right? Because a lot of, I think companies kind of try to not focus on customer service or make it really cheap or, not put a lot of resources there. And I think it's one of the most important things that your company can do is to make sure that make it easy for your customers to reach out to you and be really good at responding to them as much as possible and listening to them. But yeah, I think looking back on it, it would have been a slightly healthier as we grew. I think because we were so much in engineering and there was nothing to push back on engineering, right? There was no sort of play between product sort of stakeholders and then people implementing the technical problems, the technical solutions, that because there wasn't that play, that the engineering was just kind of figuring out what it was going to do and then implementing it, and there was nobody to say no or to say, maybe this isn't a good idea. I think it turned out okay, but it made for possibly an unhealthy work environment at times, right? Sort of elitism or people saying we only hire the best, which is highly subjective, right?
But in theory, that's a good thing, no?
It can be, but it's so subjective as to what the best means, right? And it also means that we never had a way to sort of bring on junior engineers and bring them up. I think there was a lot of, other teams aren't as important as us sort of mentality in engineering, which is not true for I mean, it's true in the very short term, but in the longer term, having respect for other organizations within your organization, I think is incredibly important to grow, right? Especially if you're going to be growing to thousands of employees. I think GitHub's 900 employees now, but yeah. So I mean, in retrospect, I think it would have been better to have a little bit more structure instead of just this sort of Wild West engineering culture. But it also, it worked. I mean, we grew and we were successful. So, but I know that there were a lot of people that were kind of hurt in that process and that it could have been avoided.
One of the things you mentioned earlier is that you listen to your community. And I think that you guys kind of grew on, we already mentioned, you grew on top of word of mouth, but I think that you grew on top of the good word of mouth also because you were able to cater to probably an unsatisfied community. Was that something that you figured out, or because you were all developers, you were all interested in Ruby and apparently on Git? So was it something that was just, this makes the most sense, and then as you progress the company, some engineers from the outside said, whoa, this is incredible, and did it grow on from there? How did you manage to manage, once again, such a big community? I mean, you say 900 developer members now. Yeah,
it was pretty difficult, actually. I think it continues to be difficult because when we started, I think we were really just focused on the Ruby community. And so this is good feedback for, anybody listening that's doing sort of product work, is if you're starting up a new company and you have this product, to not be super broad, but to choose one specific persona, right? One specific type of customer and make them incredibly happy, as opposed to, be available to a broad range.
1,000
larger, yeah, exactly. And so we focused on the Ruby community. We were all Ruby developers. So we had the added advantage of we were our own core audience. But we really looked at the Ruby community and tried to make sure that they were happy, and went to conferences and talked to people about the product and made sure that it was solving all of the needs of this core community. As we grew, I think it became difficult because we didn't understand the problem sets of different types of developers, right? So to make Java developers' lives easier, like what does that mean? Like none of us had really ever written corporate Java code, or Windows developers, like none of us had ever written a line of code on a Windows machine before. What does that look like? How are those problem sets different? How does Git work on those? Or what does open source in that community mean? And all of these answers are vastly different, right? And there were ones that we had a really, really hard time understanding. And so I think as we grew, and it continues today, like there are still pockets of like groups of developer communities that aren't using GitHub, and having GitHub try to figure out how do we solve their problems as well and sort of bring them into the fold is constantly a difficult problem. So I think it was just as we were growing, we would hire developers from these communities and say, teach us, what these
are your pains
need,
and
how we can solve them.
That's interesting, because then you were basically getting, I won't say the enemy, but getting someone from the outside unknown world and figure out what their pains were, so you were able to cater to their needs. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And the other thing that we would do is go to conferences that were focused on these communities and give presentations on this is what it looks like from the Ruby world or something like that. Here's what Git is, and then people would come up to us after and say, this is irrelevant to our community because of this thing, or this would be great except for this problem, right? And so we would learn a lot from the communities through conferences. So we traveled, we made sure, we tried to encourage our employees to travel to conferences and to speak and to get in front of the community so that they would get feedback from everybody, right? That was a really important thing for us and I still try to do a lot is speak at conferences and talk to people because that are in the communities that I'm looking at, because people in person, I think, can be really honest about problems or about needs, but they won't necessarily like go out of their way to email you this information, right? So I think actually meeting your customers is really important as well.
Another thing you've mentioned several times is open source, and I'm once again not technically gifted, and I have always one fear of the idea of open source, and I think that you've had this conversation several times, but I just want to be sure. So open source, in essence, is showing the source code of your product, of your service, everything that's code.
Right.
Source code, once again. Open source basically is showing how everything works. What's stopping me, for example, from copying you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things here. One is that open source is more of a sharing philosophy, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean, so GitHub itself is not open source. The code that runs the website is not open source. I'll answer that in a second of what would it mean if it were. We had conversations about open sourcing it. And there are competitors of ours that are open source. There are companies that do that. But the important thing for open source is more sharing pieces, right? And so if I write a library that does something very specific purpose, right? If it I don't know, takes spoken speech and turns it into text or something like that, and I spend a whole bunch of time on this code, you can do two different things. You can keep it for your company, or you can make it open source and share it with the community so that anybody else that has this problem can use that as well. And the open source, the thing that makes it interesting is that it does seem like you're just kind of giving it away, I think, is sort of the older mentality for it. The open source mentality is you're sharing it, other people can take it and can improve it, and then can share those improvements with you, right? And so what it ends up being is that sort of anything that is not core to what you're doing, what your business is doing, something that is sort of a generalized problem that you've had to fix, you share it with community, and then you all work on it together. So that way you kind of outsource, or I guess pool resources, right? So 100 companies can all have engineers work on one product, and then they don't all have to put all of the effort into it. And so that's kind of, I think, the idea of open source is, or at least from a corporate philosophy, is that anything that's not core to the business, you open source, and then that just shares the resources with or you share resources with everybody else to work on problems that aren't your core problem, right? And that way it's really nice, because when you start up a new company as a software sort of based company, you have all of these hundreds of thousands of libraries to choose from that you don't have to rewrite all of that code. And you can pull it and use it. And any problems you have with any of it, you can fix it, right? And then share it with the community, and then the rest of the community doesn't have that problem again. That's the idea. And so GitHub really encourages that and facilitates that, right? If you were to go and look for a library that does something, you'd probably go to GitHub first and look for it, because there's so much source code there. And that's what open source means.
And another question that I have is that, having worked in the blockchain area, I think I seem to see that almost every blockchain project not only is open source, but is also on GitHub.
Yeah.
Why do you think that open source is such a big thing in the blockchain area as well?
I wish I could answer that question better, but I'm not very good at sort of the technical underpinnings of blockchain technology, and so I'm not entirely sure. I would assume that there is some mechanism for which there's sort of a security mechanism behind a lot of the blockchain technologies, where it's important to see the source code so that you know that something isn't being sort of gamed in the system, right?
Okay.
For distributed technologies, I think that can be very important. But that's a little bit different. I think most of the open source, that's sort of a business reason for it, right? And there are companies that do that again, that open source the source code of their entire service. And a lot of that is for security reasons, right? So you can make sure, like, this is how this code works. It's not gaming the system somehow. But also, if you want to feature like in some instances, your customers can modify it and either run a modified.
Linux is a case of that, right? It's fully open source.
Yeah, Linux is a case of that, but it's not a company, right? So there are companies that offer services sort of on top of Linux, like Red Hat and SUSE and stuff. But it's not sort of.
It's not a company.
Yeah, it's not a company.
Like so it's Linux. Not profiting out of that,
right?
So like Mozilla, it's the same thing.
But Linux is a great example of the first idea of this, the sort of corporations collaborating on a shared problem with open source, because Linux is actually mostly developed by developers that work in organizations. So I think Microsoft actually is one of the largest contributors to Linux patch-wise these days, because they're using it for their Azure services, and they have a lot of Microsoft developers working on Linux, right? And so Microsoft is spending all of this money on all this developer time to provide patches to Linux and to help maintain it. GitHub had a Git developer that was working on open source full time. Most of Linux, if you look at like the Linux report, it is contributed by corporations, right? It's developers that are being paid by corporations to work on something on this operating system that everybody takes advantage of.
Before we go on and talk a little bit more about Chatterbug, I just have a couple more questions. So I read from your LinkedIn, you say that from all the years you're working at GitHub, you were doing sales, financial forecasting, office planning, whatever. And I'm going to basically rip this question from Tim Ferriss, with the founder of Dropbox. Sales specifically, it's something that usually engineers are not keen on doing.
Yeah.
What made you, was it because it was necessary? Did you read anything, or did you learn on the job, or was it?
Yeah, so sales at GitHub was a little bit weird. We didn't do any outbound. I mean, again, we didn't do really any marketing. It was all word of mouth, and we didn't do any outbound sales. So it wasn't sales in the sense of like cold calling or that type of thing. But when organizations would have developers that were using GitHub internally, and then the developer would try to sell into their own organization, right? We should use GitHub. And then they would have somebody reach out and want to have a conversation with us about pricing or what that looks like. And we started selling an on-premise version because the companies wouldn't want their source code to be on our servers. And so sales in this sense meant going out, talking to them about their needs, figuring out how we could help, if they had features that they needed that we could implement for a corporate perspective. And there was a lot of information we got out of that. Like we started implementing single sign-on systems that corporations use and enterprises use. I'd never really worked in an enterprise company. So in this sense, sales was about talking with customers, figuring out what their needs are, and then figuring out how we can help them, which I think is actually good sales, right? Like I think that most good sales do that. But eventually, we hired professional salespeople. But I think it's like anything in a startup, right? Like the first couple of people are going to do every possible job, and I think it's good to build empathy for all of these different roles in a company. so that by the time you get big enough to bring somebody on full time, that you really have an understanding of what you need, how you want them to do it. And for sales, it was, we wanted to make sure that we respected our customers, that we weren't doing a lot of cold calling, that we weren't bothering people, that we were trying to find out in a real way what their problems were and how we could solve them. And so, any of those hats that I wore, I think boiled down to gaining empathy for a role that we would have to expand.
But was it learned on the job, or do you have any kind of resources?
Yeah, no, it was all just sort of, actually, not only was it learned on the job, in a lot of these cases, it was just sort of made up, right? We would figure out, we wouldn't say we want sales, in order to drive revenue. We would look at what is sales, like what do we actually want to accomplish, and we'd think about this as a group of the four of us, as the co-founders. We would meet every week and have discussions about what do we want this thing to look like. It doesn't need to look like what it looks like everywhere else. We can approach the problem from first principles and say, what do we really want to accomplish?
First principles?
It was the way that we talked about sort of breaking down everything to the simplest thing and then building it back up.
Isn't that Socrates or something? I think that Elon Musk always uses the first
it's a physics principle, I think, is going, like, forgetting what you think you know and thinking about what are we really trying to solve here, and then rethinking the problem. And sometimes it was good. Sometimes I think it made the whole company be creative about a lot of things. And we would always tell people to approach it from first principles, right? There was a famous quote by Ford, I think. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was about, if I listened to my customers, like I would have built faster horses, right? And that's the idea of first principles, is listening to your customers and saying, okay, what do they really want, and start from that, and then figure out a better way for them or for us, or sort of together, and not just build exactly what they want. And I mean, that applies to sales, that applies to office design. We had highly remote work, right? We had a bunch of remote employees, and so we really spent a lot of time trying to think of, why do we have people, like, why do companies want people to come into an office? Like, what does it provide them? What does it provide the employee? What are the fundamental principles that underlie having an office as a company, right? What function does it serve? And if it's just to make sure that your employees are working, then that's a pretty flawed principle, right? Especially now, especially in this sort of knowledge environment. Knowledge work environment, is like, if you can't trust your employees to do that, then what are you, like, forcing them to be in a place so you can keep an eye on them is not going to make them work better, right? Or work smarter. And so all of these things, I think we would try to approach it from first principles, say, what are we really trying to do here, and then rethink the problem so that it's a better solution. And sometimes we ended up making mistakes that are, hundreds of years old, right? That companies have not been, or have processes in place in HR or whatever to avoid, and we didn't know it, and we relearned the mistake. And in other cases, I think we were innovative, and we inspired a lot of our employees, and built an inspired product that ended up working out very well. So it's hard to say whether it was a good idea to do that or not. I think if I had to do it over again, we would still approach a lot of these problems this way. The mistakes maybe were worth the innovation, but I suppose it depends on the particular problem.
Now, before we go on to chat about the last area that I just wanted to mention is the acquisition by Microsoft. First of all, were you still at GitHub when the acquisition went through?
No. So actually, two things. It hasn't closed yet, so it's still subject to regulatory approval. It'll probably close by the end of the year.
So all the values that are outside are just reports. There's still not a clear public value of that?
Right.
Okay.
So there's no stock or cash exchanged yet.
Okay.
GitHub's still operating independently. The new Microsoft management, by management I mean CEO, Microsoft is having Nate Friedman be the new CEO, who's a big open source guy, has been in the Linux and Microsoft communities for a long time. And I think is going to be a great CEO, but that hasn't actually happened yet, right? So that'll happen in a little while. But there is a definitive agreement, right? And so that was what Satya announced. And I left GitHub 2 years ago to start Chatterbug. And then I left the board of GitHub 1 year ago, I think. So I actually am not involved in GitHub on a day-to-day process or basis anymore. I still talk with people there. I still keep up with what's going on. I visit the office occasionally, but not on a daily basis. I do still have all my stock from my founder stock from the time, and so I am sort of heavily. They called me maybe a week beforehand to let me know what was going on and to get a letter of endorsement as a major shareholder. But yeah, it's not quite over yet.
Okay, so and the second question, because then if you're no longer there, I mean, you can have opinions, but were you there when? Let me rephrase this. How long is usually an acquisition process? How long does it take usually?
It depends on the acquisition. I think a lot of large deals, especially by Microsoft, have to go through antitrust in the United States. So it has to be approved by federal government and also a lot of different places that Microsoft operates. So the EU, we're trying to, I think they're trying to get it through merger approval from the EU as well. So there's a whole bunch of different places that need to say yes, and they need to get them all done sort of before the final deal. But yeah, so I don't know what the process is like usually. I've never really been through an M&A process. So
you weren't there when that process began, basically?
No,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, then the questions I had more specifically in terms of the acquisition process, I want to ask you specifically because you were not there, so I can't ask. Thank you so much for plugging into this episode. I truly hope you love this conversation as much as I did. I know you wanted to stay here and listen to the full conversation, and I hope you're as excited as me to listen to the second part of the interview. Any information that you might have missed will probably be linked up in the show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, consider subscribing to make sure that this podcast grows and we can get to more people and help everyone be the pioneers of their lives and careers. Also, if there's any feedback that you might have for me, please reach out on social media or leave a review. I will always read, and if there's any interesting reviews, I will also share them on the show. A big thank you to Scott for his time, and to Thibaut Flondlin, aka DJ Rodia, check it on the show notes, for the music of the Pioneers Show. Talk to you on Monday when the new episode is released. Until then,